When I cut the engine, everything stopped. The wind, the wings, my breath. There was nothing left but the lights below. From the memoirs of Nadya Popova, she flew 852 night missions. Every single time she cut the engine and entered the silence. 1942, the Eastern Front, Soviet Union. The war had been burning across these lands for a year, and it had consumed everything in its path. Villages, factories, railways. The Germans were pushing east, and the Soviet army was pulling back a little further every single day. In Moscow, Irina Sebrova sat in an office. In front of her lay hundreds of application forms, all of them from women. They wanted to fly. They wanted to fight. Sebrova was the most celebrated female pilot in the Soviet Union. She had broken records, earned medals, but the task now in front of her was something different: to build a combat unit out of these women. Stalin had not approved it at first. What business did women have at the front? But Sebrova had pushed, and eventually the order came through. 3 separate women's air regiments were formed. The most famous of them would become the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. The average age of its pilots was 20. Their aircraft were Polikarpov Po-2 biplanes, built from wood and canvas, one of the most primitive aircraft of the entire Second World War. But in their hands, that aircraft would become a lethal weapon.
The Po-2 had originally been designed for agricultural and training purposes. Its maximum speed was 120 kilometers per hour, far slower than any German fighter aircraft. Its payload capacity was extremely limited, carrying only 2 small bombs at a time. But these limitations gradually became tactical advantages. Although the aircraft's wood and canvas construction didn't absorb radar signals, it flew so low and so slowly that the German radar systems of the period could rarely detect it at all.
On the night of her first mission, Natalia Mechlin said afterward that she felt nothing, not fear, numbness. Her uniform was a man's, too large for her frame. Her boots shifted loosely on her feet. The cockpit was so small she was practically knee to knee with her navigator, and the darkness ahead of them had no end. They were flying low, very low, just above the tree line. German radar systems couldn't pick them up at that altitude, but flying low brought its own dangers. Enemy ground fire, searchlight towers, sudden shifts in the wind. And then there was the cold. They flew in open cockpits. In winter, in temperatures of -30 degrees, gloves didn't help. Faces went numb, eyes watered constantly, and the tears froze on their cheeks before they could fall. Natalia described that first night this way. I couldn't feel my hands. I had to look down to check whether I was still holding the controls. But the most dangerous moment hadn't arrived yet. As they approached the target, the pilot cut the engine. The decision was tactical. With the engine off, the aircraft was silent. German soldiers on the ground wouldn't hear it coming. But with the engine off, the plane was only gliding. Control became limited, and the smallest mistake, the smallest shift in the wind, could end everything. In the darkness, in complete silence, 2 young women were gliding toward the lights below.
Night bombing tactics were not uncommon in the Second World War, but the approach developed by the 588th Regiment was unique. As they neared their target, pilots would cut their engines and enter a silent glide. During this maneuver, the only sound the aircraft produced was the wind moving through its wing wires. German soldiers on the ground later reported that this sound resembled the noise of a broomstick moving through air. That association, the witch's broom, played a direct role in the regiment earning its nickname, the Night Witches.
Summer 1942. The regiment was flying regular missions now, but the losses had begun. The first losses came from mechanical failure. The Po-2 was a reliable aircraft under normal conditions, but war changed everything. One night, an engine failed in the dark, and the aircraft went down behind enemy lines. The 2 women inside were never heard from again. Commander Yevdokia Bershanskaya stood at the morning briefing. Her face was hard. Her voice was quiet. "We continue," she said. Nothing else. The decision was collective in its own way. Nobody in the regiment wanted to pull back. because pulling back wouldn't just end their story. It would end the future of every female pilot who came after them. Stalin was already watching this experiment with skepticism. One failure could mean the whole thing would be shut down. But there was a deeper reason too. Pilot Irina Sebrova had written this in her diary. Maybe we knew we might not win this war, but that wasn't why we kept going. It was what we'd left behind. My mother, my brother, my village. We were going for them. That sentence carried the spirit of the entire regiment. The missions continued. 8 to 12 sorties every night on average. Some nights the weather was so bad that flying seemed impossible. On those nights, Bershanskaya would climb into a cockpit herself and test the conditions. If it could be flown, it was flown. The Germans now knew these women existed, and they were making plans to stop them.
The 588th Night Bomber Regiment flew a total of 23,672 sorties over the course of the war, an extraordinary number for a single unit. On a given night, individual pilots might fly 8, sometimes 15 separate missions. Between each mission, the aircraft was refueled and reloaded, while the pilots rested for a few minutes. The Germans deployed specialized night fighter units to stop the regiment, but the PO-2's low and slow flight profile consistently defeated their radar systems.
Nadya Popova never forgot that night. It was the autumn of 1942. The target was a German fuel depot. Popova was flying low with her navigator Katya. The air was cold and the clouds sat low. That was good. Visibility was down. 1 kilometer from the target, the engine cut out. Silence. Only the wind against the wing wires. And below, in the darkness, the lights of the German base. As Popova glided in, she noticed something. There was movement below. Vehicles. Beams of light moving across the ground. The base was awake. Turning back was possible. Nobody had seen them yet. Popova didn't turn back. When they reached the release point, Katya reached out and dropped the bombs. The first explosion lit up the ground below. The second hit the fuel depot directly. A column of orange fire shot up into the sky, and in that moment, everything changed. German searchlights burst to life. Beams swept across the sky. One of them found them. Popova squeezed her eyes shut. She was completely blind for a few seconds. The engine fired back up, full power, but the searchlights stayed with them. Popova threw the aircraft into a hard maneuver. Right, left, down. The PO-2 wasn't built for this, but Popova pushed it anyway. Then they broke into the darkness. When they got back to base, Popova's hands were shaking. Katya hadn't said a word the entire mission. The two of them sat in silence in the cockpit for a while. Then Katya spoke. "We're going back tomorrow, aren't we?" Popova laughed. "Yes," she said. "Tomorrow again."
German searchlight systems posed a critical threat during night operations. Once a single searchlight locked onto an aircraft, others would converge on the same target, and the plane would immediately come under fire. The pilots of the 588th developed a specific tactic to escape this. They called it the searchlight trap. One aircraft would deliberately draw the searchlights onto itself, while the second dropped its bombs and escaped. It was an extremely dangerous maneuver, and every pilot who took on the role of drawing the lights accepted the real possibility that she would not come back.
In the regiment's first year, 23 pilots were killed. That number looks cold on paper, but inside it, every one of them had a story. One was 18 years old. She had just finished flight school. One was engaged, a wedding date already set. One hummed the same song before every mission. Nobody knew the name of the song. Pilot Polina Gelman described that period this way. "In the morning, we would look at the empty bunks. Nobody said anything. In the evening, we flew again." There is a great deal living inside that sentence. There was no time to grieve. The missions continued. After every loss, the regiment returned to the same routine. Morning briefing, aircraft maintenance in the afternoon, missions at night. Emotions were put somewhere. Nobody knew quite where. The heaviest loss came in 1943. Ksenia Kruglova and her navigator didn't come back from a mission. A search was conducted. Nothing was found. No aircraft, no trace. They had simply gone. These women had grown up together inside this regiment. They had slept in the same barracks, eaten at the same table, known each other's fears. Losing a friend was different from a battlefield loss. It went deeper. It was quieter. Bershanskaya, when she spoke about those days, said this: "The hardest part was sleeping, because in the dreams, they all came back."
The 588th Regiment lost 30 pilots over the course of the war. The majority of those losses came not from enemy fire, but from poor weather conditions and mechanical failure. The Po-2's open cockpit left pilots completely exposed to both enemy fire and the elements. Post-war studies showed that the vast majority of the regiment's surviving members carried serious long-term psychological trauma. The legacy of the 588th Regiment today sits at the intersection of military history and the study of human endurance under extreme pressure. The testimonies of Nadya Popova, Irina Sebrova, and the other survivors were rediscovered by the wider world after the opening of Soviet archives following the Cold War. The story continues to be told because what lives inside it is universal. That narrow space between fear and choice, and what a person decides to do when they're standing right on that line. But at the time, there was neither the language to describe it, nor any support structure to address it.
The war ended. Germany surrendered. The guns fell silent across Europe. The pilots of the regiment returned to Moscow. There were parades, medals, applause. The unit had been renamed the 46th Taman Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment. Stalin himself had given it that designation. But the ceremonies ended, and life moved on. Most of the pilots went back to university. They became engineers, doctors, teachers. Some married, some didn't. Their wartime stories didn't fit inside ordinary life somehow. They tried to tell them, but the people listening could never quite understand. Years later, in an interview, Nadya Popova said this: "People ask us how we did it, and every time I think the same thing. What else were we supposed to do?" That sentence carries a great deal. These women didn't see themselves as heroes. They had done a job, a hard job, a dangerous job, but a job. And somehow that perspective made them stronger than any other framing could have. The women the Germans had called night witches may not have changed the war on their own, but they had existed fully inside it, completely and without compromise. And that existence shaped everything that came after.
The 46th Taman Guards Regiment became one of the most decorated units in the Soviet military over the course of the war. 23 pilots received the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor the country could bestow. For decades afterward, the regiment's story was used as a tool by the Soviet propaganda machine. But the personal testimonies and diaries that emerged after the Cold War revealed something far more complex and human than the official narrative had ever shown. The real story of these women was not built from propaganda. It was built from individual courage, one night at a time.
Nadya Popova passed away in 2013. She was 91 years old. In her final years, she gave occasional interviews. Journalists would come. Cameras would be set up. Questions would be asked. Popova answered them patiently. But there was one question that stopped her every single time. "Were you ever afraid?" Popova would think for a moment. Then she would say, "I was afraid every night. But if fear is what stops you, then it becomes truly dangerous. I learned to live with fear. I learned to fly alongside it." That one sentence tells the whole story of the 588th Regiment. These women were not fearless, flying in an open cockpit at -30 degrees in a wooden aircraft, in complete darkness over enemy lines. Being fearless was not possible. Fear was there, always. But they had chosen to fly alongside it anyway. The Germans had called them witches. They had assumed these women possessed some supernatural power because there was no other way to explain it. Something that came in silence, that couldn't be seen, that came back every single night. But there was nothing supernatural about it. There were only young women, 20 years old on average, women wearing boots too large for their feet, gripping the controls with frozen hands. waking each morning to look at empty bunks and getting back up every evening. The war ended. The front lines closed. The aircraft were moved to museums. But the sound of that silent glide, the moment the engine cut out, the wind moving through the wing wires in the dark, that sound didn't disappear, because some sounds live forever inside the silence.